Hey guys, this is Pablo with Meditation Amsterdam. And in this video, I want to offer a pointer that could save you many years of practice and confusion in your spiritual endeavors, and to clarify, or not so much shortcut, but rather to make the work much more direct and efficient. And it takes a while to learn this, and it also takes a while to actually um, um, practice it or implement it. And the reason for this is that the ego, the ego mind, is a very sneaky and very clever mechanism. But knowing this can be a great pointer to avoid spending time in fairly useless speculation, theory, and practice. Now, this has to do with the sense of doership, or the individual sense of self, and it comes up in almost every spiritual question that people ask when they are trying to grapple with how to get around the ego, or how to see through the ego, how to correctly deal with this whole thing. Now, there's a type of question that this does not apply to, and these are practical questions. In other words, if there is a practical question such as how do I deal with strong emotions that are coming up, or if I feel like I'm grappling with a certain type of embodiment technique, for example, those are valid questions, because techniques about the regulation of the nervous system, the orientation of our attention into a certain part of our experience, that can be handy, right? It's handy to know how to do some of these techniques that prepare our nervous system, that help us clarify our mind. That's valid. So these practices and these questions have a place. The kind of spiritual question that I'm trying to dismantle at the root is the type of question that comes from trying to get around the ego or outsmart the ego, or when we find ourselves grappling with certain emotions that keep coming back, or where we feel that we are really at the mercy of what our mind keeps doing to us. Yeah. And so what is very often the case in Neo-Advaita circles is to say, somebody will ask something, and then the teacher will say, who's asking that question, right? And it feels like a very annoying response. And to my mind, it is kind of an annoying response, because it only tells you half the story. It doesn't really tell you what to do from there. There is something to be done from there. And what the teacher is trying to point at is that there is no one to do it, but to arrive to that conclusion is done through clarifying the sense of self from which the question is being asked. Now, that sounds kind of complicated perhaps, or maybe it's a little bit tricky. So let's try to deconstruct this. Say that I am dealing with a difficult situation at work. Okay, so let's make this very pragmatic. Say that I have a boss that is very, very aggressive, or annoying, or perhaps unprofessional, you name it. Now, I feel like I have an issue with this person, and then the question will pop up: how do I tackle this situation in a way that is spiritual? In other words, in a way that is non-egoic. Yeah, so the construct of the question is, how do I respond in a spiritually correct way rather than an egoic way? And that's typically going to be the setup for these kind of questions, right? Now, notice that your response to the situation is coming from the current way in which your mind and your nervous system is wired, and the kind of notions that you hold about how reality works. In other words, by the time the response of nuisance or annoyance at your boss comes up in that moment, is already predetermined. It's kind of where you're coming from, rather than something that you could try to manipulate. So there's a couple of things happening here. One is we are trying to deal with things at the level of effect rather than to look at cause. And the other one, which is the more insidious and pervasive one, and hence the title of the video, the answer to every single spiritual question, it is assumed that there is an I who is at the receiving end of the experience of being annoyed, and who can have agency or power to change the experience of being annoyed on that level. Both of those assumptions are incorrect, but the assumption of being a self is the more incorrect one of the two. It's more at the root of the incorrectness. So when the neo-advaita or the annoying teacher tells you who's asking this question, what that person is trying to do, in a way that to me is kind of an asshole move, to be honest, because there's no guidance being provided, or not enough to my taste, is they're trying to make you pause and say, notice that you are asking this from an apparent sense of self. There is an apparent I or an apparent self that wants to know how to manhandle the situation so that it is better. And it can't be done because the situation is already happening, one, and secondly, because that sense of self that wants to change it doesn't really exist. That seems like a hopeful scenario, but it isn't, because what we can do is, rather than looking at the level of effect, being annoyed at the boss, and at the level of desire, I want to not be annoyed at the boss, we could rather look at where the sense of self is springing from. And what is the difference between my sense of self and the experience of being annoyed? Is there a difference between the two? Can I use my attention to find the difference between what I call I and what I call the experience of being annoyed? What's the difference between those two? Is there a difference between those two? We rarely get the answer straight away, because people think that, oh, then you won't do the work, or I don't know. It's almost like giving the game away and staying mysterious. I don't know why people don't tell you the answer. The answer between the separate sense of self and the experience of being annoyed is that the separate sense of self is the resistance, or trying to stay separate from, a move of separation away from the full experience of being annoyed. It's a rejection of being annoyed. That's where the sense of self arises. And once we reject the experience of being annoyed and we consider ourselves a separate self, then the desire arises, how do I prevent myself from being annoyed? But that self that arose is not a real self, is the resistance to the immersive experience of being annoyed. Is trying to not be annoyed is the sense of self that believes it is separate from the nuisance that is happening to it. So going back to non-duality, we are not separate from our experience. We are our experience, on a certain way of looking at it. And to believe ourselves to be someone to whom experience is happening, aka the separate sense of self, which comes from resistance, then pops the question, out of desire, how do I stop myself from being annoyed from my boss? It's a losing game, therefore. You see, that sense of self that desires not to be annoyed is a false self. It doesn't really exist. It's made of resistance. That's the answer. It's an answer that needs to be experientially investigated and found to be the case rather than conceptually, because you can listen to this, but it's not going to solve the problem. Nuisance or being annoyed or irritated by your boss can be resolved by fully immersing yourself in the experience and accepting it for what it is, from which place you can, in a very proactive and balanced way, either confront your boss or leave that job, or come to terms, if neither can be really done, that this is the case. But that coming to terms, it won't be as a separate self, which is what creates the irritation, or that this should not be the case. That's what gives the situation its emotional distaste and that additional psychological I don't want this, which is what creates the suffering in the psychological suffering in that situation. There's a lot of annoying things that happen to us all the time. Some of them are minor nuisance, and we don't ruminate over them because we allow our system to fully imbibe the experience. Yeah. And so so rather than pointing you towards, or rather than dismissing your question as like, so who's asking the question, right? Which is this sort of clever, being slick and annoying type of teaching. It's rather pointing you to investigate that the desire to outsmart the ego or respond in a more spiritual way, or to solve your emotional hang-ups, is a desire that is being prompted by an apparent sense of self, which springs from resistance to direct experience as it is, which can only be found out through the use of your attention, not so much towards investing that attention in solutions to your emotional problems or to your spiritual problems, but rather the use of your attention to the clarification of what is that sense of self in actuality. That's the correct investment of attention, and hence the title of the video. The answer to every single spiritual question is investigate the I that wants to know the answer, because that I is false and it prompts 1,000 questions, and we could answer all of them and none of them will satisfy, because the false I continues to be the source of questions and continues to be the source of suffering. Yeah. Now, it takes skill, persistence, and real dedication and sincerity to keep finding ourselves out, to keep not giving ourselves a pass, which is what the mind constantly wants to do. Now, this problem really is real. Forget about all my spiritual practice. This asshole who did X or Y or Z to me, I'm really justified in being annoyed or being, rightfully indignant. And now I want to try to be indignated and to underpin that with spiritual values or whatever. And how do I become spiritual in this situation? We get completely tangled up in these things. And if that happens on an ongoing basis, our unresolved pain and our unresolved psychology and our karmic knots in our psychosomatic system, so long as they are there, they will prompt little selves that want to fight with things and people. This will continue to happen on and on and on. And our task is not so much to prevent that from happening. Our task is to develop the skillful use of our attention to, rather than prevent that from happening or get tangled up into how do I now deal with this spiritually, which is yet another little ruse of the ego, to use our attention skillfully to go, there's a self here that has arisen, which believes that it needs to now ask a spiritual question or try to make it better somehow. And can I use my attention to investigate what is it that I'm trying to not feel at this moment? My attempt to not feel feels like a self, right? So if you look a couple of videos back, I called the video, I self, therefore I avoid. Okay, so this is it. This is the master key to the whole thing, is so long as there's an apparent self, either asking a spiritual question or trying to resolve something in a spiritual kind of way, you can be sure you've already gone down the egoic path, because that separate sense of self is tricking us, right? We ought to investigate where it's coming from to do the proper clarification and to dissolve that sense of self by not contending with it, but rather to feel the hidden unwanted emotion that is underpinning it. Okay, so repressed emotion and the clarification of that, rather than grappling with is this spiritual or not, or how do I make myself do this or that, is the name of the game in this case. It doesn't get more clear than this, really. This is what needs to be done, and it becomes more subtle, so that the ego gets more clever over time. It throws curveballs that entangle us, and some of them become so spiritually clever that the game becomes very interesting at some point. Yeah, but it's better to be playing that game skillfully, knowing what to do every time around. The answer is the same every time around. There's no different answers, and there are no spiritual conundrums. Okay, there are no spiritual mysteries or paradox. This is this path, this confusing path. It's not a confusing path. It is when the skillful means have not really been imbibed and understood correctly, and we're still trying to weasel our way out of feeling stuff that we don't want to feel. Yeah, and once that is seen for what it is, then it becomes a very clear path. It doesn't mean that that is an easy path, but it is simple in that sense. Yeah. So I hope that helps, and as ever, I'm curious to hear what you guys make of the topic. So share it in the comment section, and also if you think that others would benefit from this video, then your liking, sharing, and subscribing gives a nice push to the channel. Thanks for watching thus far if you did, and I'll be back with more videos pretty soon. Cheerio. Bye-bye.